For centuries, the teachings of the Buddha and the wisdom of those who walk the path of loss have offered something rare and precious, not a way to escape grief, but a way to move through it with grace. These are stories for the broken-hearted, stories for the person who has cried until there was nothing left and then cried again, stories for anyone who has ever loved something deeply and then had to learn how to live without it. So if you are here tonight, if you found this video in a quiet moment of pain, know that you are not alone. Grief is one of the most human things there is, and you are allowed to feel every part of it. Take a slow breath. Let your body settle and allow these stories to come to you, not as lessons to memorize, but as companions to sit beside you in the dark. Let us begin. Story 1. Visakha, the grandmother who did not weep. There is a story in the Udana about a woman named Visakha, who was one of the most devoted lay supporters of the Buddha in all of ancient India. She was wealthy, generous, and deeply loved throughout the city of Sabatthi. She had built a great monastery for the Buddha and his monks with her own resources, and she had spent decades practicing the teachings with a sincerity and depth that few could match. By the time the story takes place, she was an old woman, a grandmother many times over, and she was known not only for her generosity, but for the particular quality of her presence, a warmth that people sought out when they were suffering, a steadiness that made those around her feel that the ground beneath their feet was solid. One day, one of her granddaughters died. The girl had been young and beloved, and her death came suddenly, the way the deaths of the young always do, without preparation, without the gradual loosening that old age allows, without any of the small mercies that make an ending bearable. The family was devastated, the household filled with the sound of weeping, and in the middle of all of it, Visakha moved through the rooms of her house with dry eyes, attending to what needed to be attended to, making the arrangements that grief leaves undone, holding the people around her who could not hold themselves. When the mourning period had passed, Visakha went to visit the Buddha at the Jetavana monastery. She arrived in the middle of the day, and the Buddha, seeing her come, noticed something in the way she walked, not the heaviness of someone who had been weeping, but the particular stillness of someone who had chosen deliberately and at some cost not to. He received her warmly and asked her to sit. Then he said simply and directly, "Visakha, you have lost your granddaughter." It was not a question. She nodded. "Yes, Venerable Sir." The Buddha looked at her with great attention and asked, "How many grandchildren do you have, Visakha?" She thought for a moment and said, "I have many, Venerable Sir. The children of my children fill my house," the Buddha said. "And how many people die each day in the city of Savatthi?" Visakha was quiet for a moment. "Many, Venerable Sir," she said. "Every day people die in this city." The Buddha nodded slowly. "If you wish to have as many grandchildren as there are people who die each day in Savatthi," he said, "would you ever be free from grief? Would there ever be a day without loss?" Visakha sat with this for a long time. Then she said, "No, Venerable Sir, there would not." The Buddha said, "Then tell me, how many people do you love so deeply that their death would break your heart?" Visakha looked at him with eyes that were clear and honest. "All of them," she said quietly. "I love all of them that deeply." The Buddha was still for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, I know. That is who you are, and that is why I want to ask you something, Visakha, not as a correction, but as a question worth sitting with. Is there a way to love them all that deeply, completely, without holding back, and still not be drowned when the water rises?" Visakha did not answer immediately. She sat with the question the way she had learned to sit with difficult things, not pushing it away, not rushing toward a resolution, but letting it settle into her the way water settles into dry earth. After a long silence, she said, "I think that is what I was trying to do today, Venerable Sir. When my granddaughter died, I did not try to stop loving her. I did not try to make the loss smaller than it was, But I also did not let myself be pulled under. I stayed on the surface of the water. I kept breathing. I kept moving. I did what needed to be done. She paused. I do not know if I did it correctly. I do not know if there is a correct way, but I did not weep. Not because I did not feel it, but because I felt it completely, and then I chose to remain standing. The Buddha looked at her with an expression that those who were present that day later described as something between deep respect and profound recognition. He said, Visakha, the person who has 100 beloved ones has 100 sorrows. The person who has 50 beloved ones has 50 sorrows. The person who has 1 beloved one has 1 sorrow. The person who has no beloved ones has no sorrow. But I am not asking you to have no beloved ones. I am not asking you to love less. I am asking you to notice the difference between grief and drowning. Grief is the honest response of a heart that loved truly. Drowning is what happens when we add to the grief the belief that we cannot survive it. He paused. You did not drown today, Visakha. You grieved. There's a great difference. Visakha sat in silence for a while. Then she said, But venerable sir, I am afraid that not weeping means I did not love her enough. That the dryness of my eyes is a failure of love rather than a strength of practice. The Buddha shook his head gently. Look at the river in the dry season, he said. The riverbed is not wet, but the river has not forgotten how to flow. It is waiting. It knows the rains will come. It does not panic in the dry season because it has been a river long enough to know that water returns. Your eyes were dry today, Visakha, but your heart was not dry. Your heart was the riverbed, holding the shape of the water, even in its absence, ready to receive whatever comes, not destroyed by the waiting. He looked at her steadily. That is not a failure of love. That is love that has learned to stand up. She left the monastery that afternoon and walked home through the streets of Savatthi as the sun was beginning to lower in the sky. Those who saw her on the road said that she walked the way she always walked, steadily, without hurry, with the particular quality of presence that made people feel, when she passed, that the world was slightly more solid than it had been a moment before. She was still grieving. Anyone who looked carefully could see it in the set of her shoulders and the way her gaze moved through the world. Not with the brightness of someone who had not lost anything, but with the steadiness of someone who had lost something real and had not been destroyed by it. She was carrying her granddaughter with her, not in her tears, in her continuing. The lesson. The story of Visakha teaches us that grief and strength are not opposites. They are not even in tension with each other. A person can feel the full weight of a loss, can love the person they lost with every part of themselves, and still choose, at some point, to remain standing. This is not numbness. It is not denial. It is not the absence of feeling. It is what feeling looks like when it has been practiced long enough to become something a person can carry, rather than something that carries them. The Visakha did not weep for her granddaughter, because she had learned through decades of practice the difference between grief and drowning. She grieved completely. She simply did not drown. And the Buddha, when he saw this, did not praise her for her strength or her discipline or her mastery of the teachings. He recognized her. He saw what she had done, and he called it by its true name, not the absence of love, love that had learned to stand up. Story 2. King Pasenadi, the king who wept. King Pasenadi of Kosala was one of the most powerful rulers in all of ancient India. He governed a vast kingdom, commanded armies, and made decisions that shaped the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. He was not a man who was expected to show weakness, and for most of his life he had not. He had learned early, as all rulers learn, that a king who weeps in public becomes a king whose subjects begin to wonder whether he is strong enough to protect them. And so he had learned to keep his grief private, to process it in the quiet of his chambers, to present to the world a face that was composed and certain, even when the interior was neither. But there is a story recorded in the Samyutta Nikaya about a day when King Pasenadi came to visit the Buddha, with tears still drying on his face. And what happened in that meeting changed something in him that no amount of power or discipline had been able to change before. The king had just received word that his grandmother had died. She was an old woman, well past 90, and her death had been peaceful and expected. By every reasonable measure, it was not a tragedy. She had lived a full life. She had died in her own bed surrounded by people who loved her. There was nothing unjust or premature about what had happened. And yet the king was undone by it, in a way he had not anticipated and could not explain. He came to the Buddha directly from receiving the news, still in his traveling clothes, his eyes red, and he sat down without ceremony and said, "Venerable Sir, my grandmother has died. She was very dear to me. If I could have prevented it by offering my kingdom, my treasury, my own life, I would have done it without hesitation." He paused and looked at the Buddha with something almost like embarrassment. "I know she was old," he said. "I know this was her time. I know the teachings say that all things are impermanent and that a wise man prepares himself for loss. But I find that I am not prepared. I find that knowing something in my mind and feeling it in my body are entirely different experiences, and I do not know what to do with the distance between those two things." The Buddha looked at him with warmth and without any trace of judgment. He did not tell the king to compose himself. He did not remind him that impermanence is the nature of all things, and that a man of his wisdom and practice should have been ready for this. He did not suggest that the king's grief was disproportionate, or that a ruler of his stature should be above such feelings. He simply received the king's words the way a deep river receives rain, completely, without resistance, without making the rain feel it has fallen in the wrong place. Then he said, "Great king, there are 4 things that are certain for all beings who are born into this world. They will age, they will fall ill, they will die, and they will be separated from everything and everyone they love. No one escapes these 4 things. Not the poor man in his hut, and not the king in his palace. Not the monk in his forest, and not the grandmother in her bed. Your grandmother has gone the way that all beings go. Your grief is not a weakness. It is the natural response of a heart that loved truly and knew the value of what it had." The king listened without speaking. The Buddha continued, "But tell me, great king, was she good to you? Did she live well? Did she bring more kindness into the world than she took from it?" The king nodded slowly. "She was the kindest person I have ever known," he said. "When I was a child and my father was distant and the court was cold, she was the one who made me feel that I was loved, not for what I would become, but for what I already was. She never wanted anything from me. She only ever gave." The Buddha said, "Then her life was a gift, and your grief is the proof of it. A man does not weep for someone who meant nothing to him. Your tears are not a sign that you have forgotten the teachings. They are a sign that you received her love and knew its value while she was still alive to give it. That is not something to be ashamed of. That is something to be grateful for." The king sat with this for a long time. Something in the room shifted, not dramatically, not with any visible sign, but in the way that rooms shift when someone in them has been carrying something heavy and has been given for the first time permission to set it down for a moment. He said, "I have been telling myself all morning that I should not be feeling this, that I knew this was coming, that she was old, and it was her time, and a wise man accepts these things." The Buddha said, "And how has that been working for you?" The king looked at him and almost smiled. "It has not been working at all," he said. The Buddha nodded. "No," he said, "it rarely does. The mind can understand impermanence completely, and the heart can still break when it arrives. These are not contradictions. They are simply different parts of the same human being responding to the same loss in their own way and in their own time. The mind moves quickly, the heart moves slowly, and grief is the heart's way of moving at its own pace through something the mind has already tried to finish." The king asked, "Then what do I do with it? I have a kingdom to run. I have people who depend on me to be steady. I cannot sit in my chambers weeping for weeks." The Buddha said, "No one is asking you to. But there is a difference between sitting in your chambers weeping for weeks and allowing yourself to feel what you feel for as long as it takes to feel it honestly. You came here today instead of going directly back to your court. That was wisdom. You sat down and told the truth about what you are carrying instead of performing composure you do not have. That was also wisdom. Grief does not require you to stop being a king. It only requires you to be honest with yourself about what it costs to love someone and then lose them. You can do both. You can grieve and still govern. You can weep and still be strong. These things are not opposites. The king left the monastery that afternoon walking differently than he had arrived. Not lighter exactly. The loss was still there, would be there for a long time. But something in the quality of how he was carrying it had changed. He had arrived holding his grief at arm's length, telling himself it was too large and too inconvenient to be fully felt, that a man of his position and his practice should be managing it better. He left having been told by someone he trusted completely that the grief was not a problem to be managed, it was a truth to be honored, and that honoring it fully, honestly, without rushing it toward resolution, was not weakness. It was the most intelligent response available to a human being who had loved someone real and lost them. The lesson of King Pasenadi is one that many of us carry without knowing it. The belief that grief requires justification, that we need to prove our loss was large enough, our relationship close enough, our pain proportionate enough to warrant the feeling we are having. The king was a powerful ruler, grieving an old woman who had died at a natural age, and even he felt he needed to apologize for the depth of what he felt. The Buddha's response was to offer no such justification and require no such proof. He simply received the grief as it was, real, present, and entirely appropriate, and reflected back to the king something he had not been able to see from inside his own pain, that the size of the grief was a measure of the size of the love, and that a love that size was not something to be ashamed of. It was something to be grateful for, even in the moment of its most acute loss. Story 3. Sunita, the man the Buddha bowed to. Long ago in the great city of Savatthi, there lived a man named Sunita. Sunita was a street sweeper, not by choice, by birth. He had been born into the lowest caste, the people his society called untouchables, and from the moment he could walk, he had been taught the rules that governed his existence. Do not touch people of higher caste. Do not enter their homes. Do not drink from their wells. When someone of higher birth walks toward you on the road, step aside, look down, make yourself small, make yourself invisible. He had followed these rules his entire life, not because he agreed with them, but because the world enforced them without mercy. And a man who fights rules he cannot change simply exhausts himself. Every morning before sunrise, while the city still slept, Sunita rose and went to work. He moved through the empty lanes of Savatthi with his long broom and his basket, sweeping away what the city had discarded the day before. The flower offerings from the temples, the waste from the market stalls, the things that people of higher birth did not want to see when they woke up. He worked in the dark so that he would be finished and gone before the streets filled with people who would have to step around him. He did not sing while he worked. He did not think much about whether his life could be different. He simply swept and went home and slept and rose again before dawn. One morning, Sunita was working in a narrow lane near the eastern road when he heard footsteps approaching. He did what he always did. He gathered his broom and his basket, pressed himself against the wall, and looked down at the ground. He had done this 10,000 times. He knew how to wait. The footsteps stopped. Sunita kept his eyes on the ground. He waited for whoever it was to pass. But they did not pass. He could feel someone standing very close to him, closer than people of higher caste ever stood near him. He did not understand this. He kept his eyes down and waited. Then he heard a voice say his name. Not you there, not sweeper. His name, Sunita. He looked up. Standing before him was a man in simple saffron robes, accompanied by a small group of monks. The man was looking directly at him, not past him, not through him, but at him, with the kind of full attention that Sunita had never in his life received from a stranger. There was no distaste in the man's face, no careful neutrality, just clear, open attention. Sunita recognized him. Everyone in Savatthi knew the face of Gautama Buddha. For a moment, Sunita could not speak. He stood with his broom in his hand and his basket at his feet, and did not know what was happening. The Buddha said quietly, "Sunita, I have been watching how you work. You rise before the sun. You do what others will not do. You ask for nothing." He paused. "Would you like to leave this life and walk a different path?" Sunita stared at him. No one had ever asked him what he would like. He began and stopped. He looked at his broom. He looked at his hands, rough and stained from years of work. He said, "Venerable Sir, I am an untouchable. I am not permitted in the places where you teach. I am not permitted to sit near men of higher birth. I do not think I am the kind of person you are looking for." The Buddha said, "I am not looking for a kind of person. I am looking at the person in front of me." Sunita was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Yes, I would like that very much." What happened next was witnessed by several people who happened to be passing through the lane that morning, and it was talked about in Savatthi for a long time afterward. The Buddha turned fully towards Sunita, and in the middle of that narrow lane, in full view of his monks and anyone who was watching, Gautama Buddha bowed, not a small nod, a full, deliberate, unhurried bow. The kind of bow that one gives to someone worthy of deep respect. The monks with him bowed as well. Sunita stood with his broom in his basket and did not know where to look. His eyes filled with tears. He had spent his entire life being made to feel that he was worth less than the dirt he swept from the streets. And now, the most respected teacher in the city was bowing to him as though he were someone worth bowing to. He set down his broom. He set down his basket. He walked with the Buddha to the monastery. In the weeks that followed, Sunita was ordained as a monk. He received the same robe, the same bowl, the same teachings as every other monk in the community. He sat in the same hall. He ate the same food. He practiced with the complete dedication of someone who has been given something they never expected to receive and does not intend to waste it. But not everyone was comfortable with this. One evening, a monk from a Brahmin family came to the Buddha with a question that was really a complaint dressed up as a question. "Venerable Sir," the monk said carefully, "it is wonderful that Sunita has joined our community. But some of us wonder, is it truly appropriate for a man of his birth to sit alongside men of Brahmin lineage?" The ancient texts say, the Buddha held up one hand, and the monk stopped speaking. "Come with me," the Buddha said. He led the monk to where Sunita was sitting in meditation beneath a tree in the monastery garden. They stood and watched him for a moment. Sunita sat completely still, his face calm, his breathing slow and even. The Buddha said quietly, "Look at this man. Look at how he sits. Look at how he practices. Look at what he has become." He turned to the monk. "Now tell me, what does his birth have to do with any of that?" The monk opened his mouth. Then he closed it. He looked at Sunita, sitting beneath the tree, and he found that he had no answer. "The river does not ask where the rain came from before it receives it," the Buddha said. "It simply receives it. And the rain, wherever it came from, becomes the river." He walked away. The monk stood for a while longer, looking at Sunita, and then he went back to his own practice. The texts record that Sunita attained full awakening, that he completed the path and became what the tradition calls an arahant, one who has seen through the nature of things completely and is no longer bound by the forces that bind ordinary human beings. He became a teacher. People came to sit at his feet. People of all castes, including people who, in the world outside the monastery, would never have sat near him. He had spent the first part of his life being made invisible. He spent the second part of his life helping other people see. The lesson Sunita's story asks one simple question: where does human worth actually come from? The society he lived in had a confident answer: from birth, from blood, from the family you were born into. This belief was not held by a few people. It was the organizing principle of an entire civilization, written into sacred texts and enforced by law. And it was wrong. The Buddha's bow was not a polite gesture. It was a direct and public statement. I see this man, I see what he is, and what he is has nothing to do with what he was born into. Most of us will never sweep streets before dawn to avoid being seen. But most of us know what it feels like to be made to feel that we are less than we are, by a system, by a family, by a voice inside our own head that has absorbed the judgments of others so completely that we no longer need anyone else to deliver them. We do it to ourselves. Sunita swept the streets of Savatthi for years before anyone looked at him directly. When someone finally did, he was ready. He had not stopped being worth seeing. He had simply been waiting for someone with eyes clear enough to see him. The question his story leaves us with is not whether the world will recognize your worth. The world is unreliable about that. The question is whether you will, before anyone bows, before anyone says your name, before anyone tells you that you are allowed to set down the broom. Story 4. Ambapali, the woman who gave everything away. Long ago in the prosperous Republic of Visakha, there lived a woman whose name was known across the whole of northern India. Her name was Ambapali, and she was the most celebrated courtesan in the land. She had not chosen this life, it had been chosen for her, when she was very young, because she was extraordinarily beautiful. And the city of Visakha had a tradition of selecting its most beautiful woman to serve as a Ganika, an official courtesan maintained by the city itself. She had been educated in music, dance, poetry, and the art of conversation. She had been taught to be charming, to be witty, to make every person in a room feel that the room was better for her presence. She had learned all of this, and she had learned it well. Kings had travelled to Visakha partly to meet her. Wealthy merchants had spent fortunes for an evening in her company. The young noblemen of the Lashav clan competed fiercely for her attention. Poets had written about her beauty. Her mango grove on the outskirts of the city was considered one of the most beautiful private gardens in the Republic. She had wealth, she had fame, she had a son she loved deeply. She had by every measure her world recognized. Everything. And quietly, without drama, without a single visible sign, she had begun to feel that everything was not quite enough. She was sitting in her garden one afternoon when her servant girl came running with news. "My lady," the girl said, breathless, "the Lachavi noblemen are riding through the city. They say the Buddha is traveling near Vesali and they are going to invite him to take a meal with them." Ambapali set down the flower she had been holding. She had heard of Gautama Buddha. Her city had been full of his name for months. People spoke of him in the market, in the temples, at dinner tables. She had listened to these conversations with the mild curiosity of someone who has many things to occupy her attention and has not yet decided whether this particular thing deserves more of it. But something about this moment, the afternoon light in the garden, the flower in her hand, the particular quality of restlessness she had been carrying for months without being able to name it, made her say almost before she had decided to say it, "Have my carriage prepared. I am going to hear him speak." Her servant stared at her. "My lady, the Lachavis will be there. Men of the highest families. Then they will see me there," Ambapali said. "Prepare the carriage." She arrived at the gathering and sat near the back, as was appropriate for a woman of her reputation. She watched the teacher from a distance. He was not what she had expected. There was nothing dramatic about his appearance, nothing that announced itself. He was a man in simple robes, sitting quietly, speaking to the people around him with an attention that seemed, even from where she sat, completely genuine. She listened. He was speaking about impermanence, about how all things that arise also pass, without exception, without negotiation. He spoke about beauty, about youth, about the things the world values most, and the particular suffering that comes from building a life on things that cannot last. He did not say these things with sadness. He said them with the calm clarity of someone describing the weather, not as a tragedy, but simply as the nature of things. Ambapali sat very still. She had known all of this in the abstract for her entire life. Everyone knew that beauty was temporary. It was stated in the texts, acknowledged in polite conversation, obvious in the faces of every woman who had ever grown old. And yet, she had spent every day of her adult life acting as though it were not true. Maintaining, protecting, investing everything in the very thing she knew would not last. Hearing it said aloud, simply and without apology, by someone who clearly had no interest in flattering her or frightening her, something shifted. After the teaching ended, she walked forward through the crowd. People stepped aside for her. They always stepped aside for her, and she came to stand before the Buddha. "Venerable Sir," she said, "would you honor me by taking a meal at my home tomorrow, you and your monks?" The Buddha looked at her for a moment. Then he said simply, "Yes, Ambapali, we will come." The next morning, as Ambapali was preparing her home for the Buddha's arrival, she heard the sound of horses on the road. She went to her gate and found a procession of young Licchavi noblemen, richly dressed, riding toward her on fine horses. Their leader called out from his horse, "Ambapali, we have heard that the Buddha has accepted your invitation for tomorrow. We will give you 100,000 gold pieces. Give us the meal instead." Ambapali looked up at him. She had spent her life accommodating the preferences of wealthy and powerful men. It was, in a sense, her profession. She said, "My lord, I would not give up this meal for the whole of Vesali." The nobleman stared at her. "You cannot be serious." "I am entirely serious," she said. "You are welcome to invite the Buddha on another occasion. This occasion is mine." She closed the gate. The noblemen sat on their horses outside her gate for a moment, genuinely astonished. Then they rode away, and Ambapali went back inside to finish her preparations. The Buddha and his monks arrived the next morning. Ambapali served them herself, not through servants, but with her own hands, moving through the hall with the same grace she brought to everything, but with a quality of attention that was different from her usual performance. She was not charming anyone, she was simply present. When the meal was finished and the monks had eaten, Ambapali came and sat before the Buddha. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Venerable Sir, I would like to give you something." "What would you like to give?" the Buddha asked. She said, "This grove, the mango grove, all of it, not the use of it, not a portion of it, all of it to you in the community for as long as it is needed." There was a silence in the hall. Her attendants exchanged glances. The mango grove was one of the most valuable pieces of land in Vesali. It was her security, her legacy, the most beautiful thing she owned. The Buddha said, "Are you certain, Ambapali?" She said, "I have been certain since yesterday morning. I simply needed to say it out loud." He accepted the gift. Years passed. Ambapali grew older. Her son Vimala became a monk. The young noblemen who had once competed for her company stopped coming. The poets who had written about her beauty wrote about other women now. The world that had valued her so extravagantly moved on, as worlds do, to the next beautiful thing. She watched all of this happen without bitterness. She had seen it coming for a long time. She had simply, finally stopped pretending that she hadn't. She entered the order and became a nun, and in her old age she composed a poem, one of the most remarkable poems in the entire Buddhist canon, in which she described her own body as it had aged. She described her hair, once black and fragrant, now thin and white. Her eyes, once bright, now dimmed. Her skin, her teeth, her hands, her back, all the things that had once been celebrated, now simply old. At the end of each description, she wrote the same line, Such is the nature of the body, such is the truth of the world. She did not write this with grief. She wrote it with the particular freedom of someone who has finally put down something very heavy and discovered that her hands still work. The lesson Ambapali's story is about the courage it takes to stop pretending. She knew her entire life that beauty was temporary. Everyone knows this. The knowledge is not the hard part. The hard part is living as though it is true. Actually building your life on something that lasts, rather than spending all your energy protecting something that won't. The mango grove she gave away was not just land, it was the physical embodiment of everything she had accumulated. Her security, her status, the proof that her beauty had been worth something. Giving it away was not poverty. It was the discovery that the thing she had been most afraid to lose did not, when she finally released it, take her with it. We are all, in some way, ambibly. We are all holding on to something we know as temporary. Our youth, our reputation, the particular version of ourselves the world has learned to value. The question is not whether we will lose these things. We will. The question is whether we wait until they are taken, or whether we find the courage to set them down ourselves, and discover, in the setting down, what was always underneath. Ambapali set hers down, and what was underneath was a woman who could write a poem about growing old without a single word of regret. Story 5. Ajatasattu. The king who could not sleep. Long ago in the great kingdom of Magadha, there was a king who had everything a king could want. Armies, treasure, a magnificent palace, the loyalty of his ministers and the fear of his enemies. His name was Ajatasattu, and by every outward measure, he was a successful man. But Ajatasattu could not sleep. He had not slept properly in years. Not since the night he had done what he had done, the night he had arranged for his own father, King Bimbisara, to be imprisoned and slowly starved to death so that he, Ajatasattu, could take the throne before his time. He had wanted the kingdom. He had wanted it badly enough to do that. And now he had it, and the having of it had not turned out to be what he imagined. During the day, there were things to occupy him, audiences to hold, disputes to settle, armies to review, the endless machinery of a kingdom that required his attention. During the day, he could almost forget. But at night, when the palace grew quiet and the lamps burned low, and there was nothing between him and his own mind, his father's face came back to him. Not angry, not accusing, just his father's face, looking at him the way his father had always looked at him, with the particular patience of a man who had loved his son completely, and had not stopped loving him even when his son had done this. That was the worst part. Not the anger he had expected, the patience. One evening, Ajatasattu was sitting in his private chambers when his chief minister came to him with a suggestion. "Your Majesty," the minister said carefully, "you have not been well. You do not sleep. You do not eat properly. The physicians have done what they can." He paused. "There is a teacher camped in the mango grove outside the city, Gautama Buddha. Many people say that speaking with him brings a kind of peace that other things cannot bring. Perhaps." Ajatasattu looked at his minister for a long moment. He was not a man who liked to admit that he needed anything. Kings who admitted need were kings who invited challenge. But he was also at this point desperate enough to try something he would not ordinarily have considered. "Arrange it," he said. That night, Ajatasattu set out with a small retinue toward the mango grove where the Buddha was staying. He rode in a covered palanquin so that he would not be recognized on the road. He told himself he was going out of curiosity, out of the kind of intellectual interest that a king might have in a famous teacher. He told himself it was not desperation. The mango grove was quiet when they arrived. The trees were large and old, and the night air was cool beneath the canopy. Torches burned at intervals along the path, and by their light, Ajatasattu could see monks seated in meditation throughout the grove. Dozens of them, completely still, their saffron robes pale in the torchlight. He stopped his palanquin and looked at them. "Where is the noise?" he said quietly to his minister who was walking beside him. "Your Majesty? There are hundreds of people here. Where is the noise?" He had attended many large gatherings, festivals, military camps, court assemblies. Wherever many people gathered, there was noise. But this grove was as quiet as if it were empty. His minister had no answer. Ajatasattu stepped down from his palanquin and walked forward on foot. He found the Buddha seated at the center of the grove, beneath a large tree, surrounded by monks in the same stillness he had seen throughout the grove. The Buddha was not performing. He was not holding court. He was simply sitting in the way of someone who has nowhere else to be, and no interest in being anywhere else. Ajatasattu stood at the edge of the circle and looked at him. He had expected he was not sure what he had expected. Someone impressive. Someone who would look at him and immediately know who he was, and adjust accordingly. The way everyone adjusted when they realized they were in the presence of the king. But the Buddha looked at him the way he seemed to look at everyone, with the same quality of complete and undivided attention that did not increase or decrease based on who was receiving it. Ajatasattu sat down. He did not announce himself. He did not present gifts. He simply sat, and the Buddha waited. And after a while, Ajatasattu said in a voice that was quieter than he intended, "I cannot sleep." The Buddha said nothing. He waited. "I have not slept properly in a long time," Ajatasattu said. "I have done something that I cannot undo, and I know that I cannot undo it, and I know that I knew, when I did it, that I could not undo it, and I did it anyway." He stopped. He had not said this to anyone before. He had barely allowed himself to think it in these exact words. "My father is dead because of me, and I cannot sleep." The grove was quiet around them. The Buddha said gently, "You have come here tonight. That is not nothing." Ajatasattu looked at him. "I killed my father." "Yes," the Buddha said. "And you are here in the middle of the night, unable to sleep, telling a stranger what you did. That is not the behavior of someone who does not know the difference between right and wrong." Ajatasattu was quiet for a long time. "Can it be undone?" he finally asked. "No," the Buddha said. "What has been done cannot be undone, but what you do from this moment forward is not yet determined. The man who did that thing and the man sitting here tonight are not the same man unless you choose to make them the same." They talked for a long time that night. The torches burned down and were replaced. The monks sat in their stillness around them. Ajatasattu asked questions, and the Buddha answered them. Not with the kind of answers that made the questions go away, but with the kind that made it possible to live with them. At some point, Ajatasattu realized that the particular tightness in his chest that had been there for years had loosened slightly. Not disappeared, not resolved, but loosened. The way a knot loosens when you stop pulling at it from the wrong direction and simply allow it to be what it is. When he finally rose to leave, he turned to the Buddha and said, "I should have come sooner." The Buddha said, "You came when you were ready." Ajatasattu bowed. A real bow, not the bow of a king performing deference, but the bow of a person who has received something genuine and wants to acknowledge it. Then he walked back through the quiet grove to his palanquin. The texts record that Ajatasattu did not become enlightened that night. He carried his guilt for the rest of his life. He never fully escaped what he had done. But something changed in him after that night in the mango grove. Something in the quality of how he carried what he carried. He became, in the years that followed, a king who was known for his support of the Buddha's community, who attended the first Buddhist council after the Buddha's death, who built stupas and supported monasteries. He did not become a saint. He became a man who had done something terrible and had chosen after that to do better. The texts also record one other detail that is easy to miss. When Ajatasattu left the grove that night, the Buddha turned to his attendant Ananda and said quietly, "That man could have gone far on this path if it were not for what he did to his father." He said it without judgment, simply as an observation, The way you might note that a tree could have grown very tall if it had not been struck by lightning when it was young. The lesson, Ajatasattu's story, is about guilt, specifically about what guilt is for and what it is not for. Guilt, at its best, is information. It tells you that you have crossed a line you knew existed. It is the evidence that your conscience is still working, that the part of you that knows the difference between right and wrong has not been entirely silenced. In this sense, Ajatasattu's sleeplessness was not a punishment. It was proof that he was still a person. But guilt, when it is not processed, becomes a prison. Ajatasattu spent years carrying his guilt in the way of someone who believes that suffering is the same as atonement, that if he feels bad enough for long enough, the debt will eventually be paid. It will not. Suffering is not the same as change. What the Buddha offered him was not forgiveness. He could not offer that, and Ajatasattu did not ask for it. What he offered was something more useful, the distinction between what cannot be changed and what can. The past is fixed. What you do next is not. Most of us have done things we cannot undo. Most of us carry something we wish we could put down. The question Ajatasattu's story asks is whether we are willing to do what he did, to go, in the middle of the night, to the one place we have been avoiding, and say out loud what we have been carrying alone. The saying of it does not undo it, but it begins something, and beginning something even late is not nothing. Story 6. Bimbisara, the king who bowed. First, long ago, in the kingdom of Magadha, there was a king named Bimbisara, who ruled from his great capital of Rajagaha, the city ringed by 5 hills. Bimbisara was not an ordinary king. He was intelligent, politically shrewd, and genuinely curious about the world in a way that most kings were not. He had built Magadha into one of the most powerful kingdoms in northern India, not through brutality alone, but through the particular combination of military strength and diplomatic intelligence that makes a kingdom last, rather than simply expand. He was respected by his allies and feared by his enemies, and he had managed, over a long reign, to be both without losing either. But Bimbisara had a quality that was unusual in a king. He was genuinely open to being wrong. Most kings surrounded themselves with people who told them what they wanted to hear. Bimbisara had spent enough time in the world to know that this was a comfortable way to become a fool, and he had made a deliberate practice of seeking out people who would tell him the truth, even when the truth was inconvenient. He had advisors who disagreed with him. He had scholars who challenged his assumptions. He had, over the years, changed his mind about important things more than once, and he had not found this shameful. He had found it useful. It was this quality, this genuine openness, that would bring him one morning to the side of a road outside Rajagaha, watching a young man walk past with a begging bull. Bimbisara had heard about Gautama, the young prince from the Sakya clan who had left his palace and his family and his inheritance to become a wandering ascetic. The story had travelled as interesting stories do, and by the time it reached Rajagaha, it had acquired the usual embellishments. Some people said the young man had been a great prince, others said he had been destined for kingship, others said he had walked away from everything on the night his son was born. Bimbisara was curious. He was always curious about people who made unusual choices, because unusual choices were usually made for reasons that were worth understanding. He had his ministers make inquiries, and one morning he was told that the youngest Siddiq was walking through the streets of Rajagaha on his morning alms round. Bimbisara did something that his ministers found mildly alarming. He went to see for himself. He stood at the side of the road with a small group of attendants and watched Gama walk past. What he saw was a young man of perhaps 29 or 30, lean from his ascetic practice, wearing simple patched robes, carrying a clay bowl, walking with a quality of attention that Bimbisara had rarely seen in anyone. The complete, unhurried attention of someone who is entirely present in each step, without being distracted by where the steps are going. He was not performing humility. He was not performing anything. He was simply walking, and the walking had a quality that made the people around him seem, by comparison, slightly absent from their own lives. Bimbisara watched him until he had passed. Then he turned to his chief minister and said, "Follow him. Find out where he goes." His ministers found that Gautama had gone to a hillside outside the city to eat his meal and rest. Bimbisara went there himself with a small retinue and sat down before the young ascetic on the grass of the hillside. He did not wait for an introduction. He said directly, "I have been watching you. I want to know what you are looking for." Gautama looked at him. He did not seem surprised to find a king sitting on a hillside asking him questions. He said, "I am looking for the end of suffering." Bimbisara considered this. It was not the answer he had expected. He had expected something more elaborate, a doctrine, a system, a set of practices. "The end of suffering," he repeated. "For yourself?" "For anyone who wishes to find it," Gautama said. Bimbisara was quiet for a moment. He was a man who had spent his life accumulating power and using it to build a kingdom, and the idea that what he had been doing had anything to do with the end of suffering had not previously occurred to him. He was not sure it had anything to do with it now, but something in the directness of the answer, the complete absence of performance or recruitment, made him want to continue the conversation. They talked for a long time on that hillside. Bimbisara asked questions and Gautama answered them, and the answers were not always comfortable, and Bimbisara did not always agree with them. But he found that disagreeing with them required him to think more carefully than agreeing would have, and he valued that. At the end of the conversation, Bimbisara said, "You have not yet found what you are looking for." "No," Gautama said, "not yet." "When you find it," Bimbisara said, "come back to Magadha, come back to Rajaga. I would like to hear what you have found." It was not a royal command. It was a genuine request from one person to another. Gautama said he would. Years passed. Gautama found what he was looking for, or rather, he found that what he was looking for had always been present, and that the finding of it was a matter of seeing clearly rather than acquiring something new. He became the Buddha. He began to teach. Word traveled as word does, and eventually it reached Rajagaha. Bimbisara remembered his promise. He sent an invitation. The Buddha came to Rajagaha with a large community of monks. Bimbisara went out to meet him, not in the formal procession of a king receiving a dignitary, but on foot, walking out through the city gate with a small group of attendants, the way you go to meet someone you have been looking forward to seeing. When he saw the Buddha approaching, Bimbisara did something that his court found deeply surprising. He bowed, not the small ceremonial nod that kings gave to respected teachers. A full, deliberate bow. The bow of someone who recognizes that the person before them has found something real and wants to acknowledge it honestly. His ministers exchanged glances. Kings did not bow to wandering monks. That was simply not how the world was ordered. Bimbisara did not see no as their discomfort. He straightened from his bow and said simply, "You came back." The Buddha said, "I said I would." What followed was one of the most significant acts of royal patronage in the history of early Buddhism. Bimbisara gave the Buddha and his community the Vayuvana, the bamboo grove, a large and beautiful park on the outskirts of Rajagaha, to use as a permanent residence and place of practice. It was the first permanent monastery in Buddhist history. Before Vayuvana, the community had been entirely itinerant, moving from place to place with the seasons, sleeping under trees, depending entirely on the generosity of whoever they happened to be near. Vayuvana changed that. It gave the community a home. It gave the teaching a place to take root. Bimbisara did not give the grove because he was required to. He did not give it as a political calculation, though he was shrewd enough to understand that having the Buddha's community in his kingdom was not a political liability. He gave it because he had sat on a hillside with a young ascetic years before and had a conversation that had changed something in how he understood the world, and he wanted to make it possible for other people to have that conversation too. He attended teachings regularly. He brought his ministers. He brought his family. He did not become a monk. He was a king and he had a kingdom to run, and he understood that his path was a different one. But he practiced what he could practice within the life he had, and he supported those who had chosen a different life with the resources that his life gave him to offer. The story does not end happily. Bimbisara's son was Ajatasattu, the same Ajatasattu who would eventually imprison his father and leave him to die so that he could take the throne before his time. The texts record that Bimbisara in prison was not given food. His wife, Videhi, was eventually forbidden to visit him. He survived for a while by walking in the small patch of sunlight that entered his cell each day because the sunlight gave him enough energy to continue. When even that was taken from him, when Ajatasattu ordered that the soles of his feet be cut so that he could no longer walk, he died. He died in a prison cell, put there by his own son in the kingdom he had built. The texts record one detail that is almost unbearable in its simplicity. When Bimbisara was in prison, he reportedly said that he held no anger toward his son. That whatever Ajatasattu had done, he had done out of the same confusion and craving that causes all human beings to do the things that harm them most. That he, Bimbisara, had spent enough time with the Buddha's teaching to understand that anger toward his son would not help his son, and would not help him, and was therefore not worth holding. Whether this is historically accurate, no one can say with certainty. But it is what the tradition remembers about him. And what a tradition chooses to remember about a person is itself a kind of truth. The lesson, Bimbisara's story, is about what it looks like when someone with genuine power chooses to bow. He was a king. He had armies, treasure, and the ability to compel. He did not need to bow to anyone. And yet he bowed, on a hillside before a young ascetic with nothing, and again at the city gate years later when that ascetic returned as the Buddha. In a world rigidly ordered by rank and protocol, a king bowing to a wandering monk was not a small gesture. It said, "There is something more important than my position." Most of us are not kings, but most of us have a position to protect, a reputation, a self-image, a story about where we stand. And most of us know the feeling of encountering something genuinely worth bowing to and finding that the bow is harder than it should be. Bimbisara bowed easily. Not because he had nothing to lose, because he had decided long before that moment what actually mattered. And in the end, when his own son took everything from him, he met it without anger. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the whole thing. Story 7. Yasa. The young man who walked out in the middle of the night, long ago, in the prosperous city of Varanasi, there was a young man named Yasa who had everything his world considered worth having. His father was one of the wealthiest merchants in the city. Yasa had grown up in a house with 3 separate pavilions, one for the cold season, one for the hot season, one for the rains, each furnished with the finest things his father's wealth could provide. He had servants, musicians, beautiful companions, silk clothing and food prepared by skilled cooks. He had never in his entire life wanted for anything material. He was also, by the time this story begins, profoundly and quietly miserable. Not dramatically miserable. Not the kind of misery that announces itself and demands attention. The quieter kind. The kind that lives underneath a life that looks from the outside entirely successful. The kind that makes you wake up in the middle of the night and lie there in the dark, wondering why the things that were supposed to make you happy have not in fact made you happy. And whether this means something is wrong with the things, or something is wrong with you. Yasa had been lying there for months. One night he woke in the middle of the night and looked around the room. The musicians had fallen asleep at their instruments. The companions who had been entertaining him earlier in the evening were sleeping in various positions around the room, some with their mouths open, some with their hair undone, some with the careful arrangements of the evening now collapsed into the ordinary disorder of sleep. The lamps had burned low. The flowers that had been fresh that evening were already beginning to wilt. Yasa looked at all of this. He had seen it before, of course. The end of an evening, the room after the entertainment, the ordinary reality underneath the performance. But tonight, for some reason he could not entirely explain, he saw it differently. Not with disgust, not with cruelty toward the sleeping people around him, but with a kind of clarity that he had not had before. The clarity of someone who has been looking at something for a long time through a particular lens, and has suddenly, without choosing to, set the lens down. What he saw was simply, this is not it. Not this room, not these things, not this life arranged around the accumulation and enjoyment of comfort. Not because these things were bad, but because they were not answering the question he had not yet known he was asking. He stood up. He put on his sandals. He walked out of the house. He did not have a destination. He walked through the sleeping city of Varanasi in the middle of the night, and as he walked, he said quietly, to no one in particular, how oppressive this is, how suffocating. He was not describing the city, he was describing something inside himself, the particular suffocation of a life that fits perfectly, and yet does not fit at all. He walked until he reached the deer park at Cūḻapanthaka on the outskirts of the city, and there, in the early hours of the morning, he found the Buddha, who was walking in meditation in the cool night air. The Buddha saw him coming and simply, "Come, Yasa, sit down." Yasa sat down. He said, "How oppressive this is, how suffocating." The Buddha said, "This place is not oppressive, Yasa. Sit here. I will teach you." What the Buddha taught him that night, the texts do not record in full detail. What they record is the shape of it, the gradual unfolding of a teaching that began where Yasa actually was, not where a teacher might have preferred him to be. He spoke about generosity, about ethical living, about the nature of the mind. He spoke about the way the things we pursue in the belief that they will satisfy us tend, upon arrival, to reveal themselves as pointing towards something further. Yasa listened, and as he listened, something in him that had been tightly wound began, slowly, to release. By the time the teaching ended, the sky was beginning to lighten. Yasa looked different, not transformed in any dramatic way, but the particular quality of someone who has been carrying a question for a long time and has found, if not the answer, at least the right direction. He asked to stay. His father came looking for him the next morning, following his son's footprints through the dew to the deer park. He found the Buddha seated beneath a tree, and the Buddha taught him too, the same teaching, beginning where the father was, unfolding at the pace the father could receive it. By the time Yasa's father had heard the teaching, he had become the first lay follower of the Buddha, the first person to take refuge, not as a monk, but as a householder, someone who would practice within the life they already had. Yasa, meanwhile, had become a monk. His father looked at his son in the robes and said, with the particular grace of a father who loves his child enough to want what is right for them rather than what is familiar, "Come home for the meal tomorrow. Bring the teacher." They came, and at that meal, Yasa's mother and his former companion, the woman who had been closest to him, also heard the teaching and became the first laywoman followers of the Buddha. One young man, walking out of his house in the middle of the night, had set something in motion that would include his entire family by the following evening. The texts also record something that is easy to miss. When Yasa's father arrived at the deer park that morning, and the Buddha began to teach him, Yasa was sitting nearby. But Yasa had already understood enough that he was, in a sense, invisible to his father. Present in the same space, but no longer quite in the same world. It is a strange detail to include, but it captures something true about the nature of genuine change. The way that when something real shifts in a person, they become briefly unrecognizable, even to the people who know them best. Not because they have become someone else, because they have become more fully themselves. The lesson. Yasa's story is about the night you look around the room and see it clearly for the first time. Most of us have had this moment, or something like it, the moment when the life that has been working, that has been providing the things it was supposed to provide, suddenly reveals itself as insufficient. Not wrong, not bad, but not enough. Not the answer to the question you didn't know you were asking. The instinct when this happens is to fix the room, to add more musicians, better food, finer silk. To adjust the arrangements until the feeling goes away. Yasa had everything his world could offer and had been, presumably, adjusting the arrangements for months. The feeling had not gone away. What he did instead, walking out into the night without a destination, saying out loud what he felt even though no one was listening, was not a plan. It was honesty. The simple, unglamorous honesty of someone who has stopped pretending that the room is enough. The teaching found him because he was moving, not because he had figured out where to go, but because he had stopped staying where he no longer belonged. Most of us wait too long in the room. We wait until the discomfort becomes undeniable, until the gap between the life we are living and the life we sense as possible has grown so wide that staying requires more effort than leaving. Yasa did not wait that long. He woke up, looked around, and walked out. That is the whole of it. The rest followed. Long ago, in the city of Visakha, there were two brothers who had both become monks under the Buddha. The elder brother was named Mahapantaka. The younger was named Cūḻapanthaka. Mahapantaka was gifted. He memorized teachings quickly, understood subtle points of doctrine without difficulty, and had progressed well along the path. He was, by any ordinary measure, a successful monk. Cūḻapanthaka was not gifted. Or rather, he had a particular difficulty that made the ordinary work of monastic life almost impossible for him. He could not memorize. This was not a minor inconvenience. In a tradition where the teachings were transmitted entirely by oral recitation, where monks were expected to memorize long passages of text and recite them accurately, where the ability to hold the words of the teaching in your mind was considered foundational to the practice, the inability to memorize was a serious problem. Cūḻapanthaka had been trying for months to memorize a single verse, 4 lines, the kind of verse a capable student could learn in an afternoon. He had been working on it every day, repeating it, going over it, starting again when he lost the thread. And after months of effort, he still could not hold it. His elder brother, watching this, eventually reached a conclusion that seemed, from the outside, entirely reasonable. He told Cūḻapanthaka to leave the monastery. "You are not suited for this life," Mahapantaka told him. Not unkindly. He was not a cruel man, but with the particular directness of someone who has assessed a situation and reached what seems like the only logical conclusion. In 4 months, you have not been able to memorize 1 verse. You will not be able to progress on this path. It would be better for you to return to lay life. Cūḻapanthaka did not argue. He did not have the confidence to argue. He had been failing at the one thing that seemed to matter, and his brother's assessment matched the one he had already formed about himself. He gathered his few belongings and walked toward the monastery gate. He sat down outside the gate and wept. Not dramatically, not the weeping of someone performing grief. The quiet weeping of someone who has been told that the thing they most wanted is not available to them, and who believes it. The Buddha was walking nearby. He saw Cūḻapanthaka sitting outside the gate, weeping. He came and sat beside him. "Why are you sitting here?" the Buddha asked. Cūḻapanthaka told him. He had been unable to memorize the verse. His brother had told him to leave. He was not suited for this life. The Buddha was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Who told you that you are not suited for this life?" Cūḻapanthaka looked at him. "My brother." "And before your brother, who told you?" Cūḻapanthaka was quiet. The answer, he realized, was himself. He had been telling himself this for months. Every time he lost the thread of the verse, every time he had to start again. The conclusion had been forming long before his brother had spoken it aloud. The Buddha said, "Come with me." He brought Cūḻapanthaka back inside the monastery. He gave him a clean white cloth and told him to hold it in his hands and repeat as he rubbed the cloth, removing dust, removing dust. That was all. Not a long verse, not a complex teaching. 2 words repeated with the hands engaged in a simple physical action. Cūḻapanthaka did as he was told. He sat in the courtyard of the monastery with the white cloth in his hands, rubbing it slowly and repeating the words. The other monks passed by. Some of them looked at him with the particular expression of people watching someone do something that seems too simple to be useful. Cūḻapanthaka kept rubbing the cloth and repeating the words. As he rubbed, the cloth began to change. It had started white and clean, but the oils from his hands, the dust of the courtyard, the simple friction of the practice, gradually the cloth began to show marks. What had been clean was becoming soiled. What had appeared pure was revealing what it actually contained. Cūḻapanthaka watched this happen, and something in him understood, not as a concept, not as something he had memorized from a teaching, but as something he had seen with his own hands, that this is what the mind is like. That what appears clean on the surface contains, underneath, the accumulated dust of habit and craving and aversion. That the practice is not the adding of something new, but the gradual, patient removal of what has always been there. He sat with the cloth until the understanding had settled into him completely. The texts record that Cūḻapanthaka attained enlightenment that afternoon, not after years of study, not after memorizing thousands of verses, after sitting in a courtyard with a piece of cloth and 2 words, paying complete attention to what was actually happening in front of him. When the Buddha later asked the assembled monks who among them had developed the mind most completely, he pointed to Cūḻapanthaka. Mahapanthaka, the gifted brother, the one who had told Cūḻapanthaka to leave, heard this, and was the text's note, somewhat astonished. The lesson Cūḻapanthaka's story is about the difference between the kind of intelligence the world measures and the kind that actually matters on the path. The world, any world, in any era, has a preferred style of intelligence. In Cūḻapanthaka's world, it was memorization. In ours, it might be something else. The ability to process information quickly, to perform well under assessment, to produce the outputs that the system is designed to reward. Whatever the preferred style is, the people who have it tend to assume that it is the only style. And the people who do not have it tend to believe them. Cūḻapanthaka believed his brother. He believed the assessment. He sat outside the gate and wept because he had accepted completely that the inability to do the thing the system valued meant the inability to do the thing that mattered. The Buddha did not tell him he was wrong to struggle. He did not offer false encouragement. He gave him a cloth and 2 words, and a practice that was exactly the right size for where Cūḻapanthaka actually was. This is the thing worth sitting with. The teaching met him where he was, not where a teacher might have preferred him to be, not where his brother thought he should be, where he actually was, sitting outside a gate, weeping, holding the belief that he was not enough. From exactly that place, with exactly that much, he went all the way. Story 9. Khema, the queen who was too beautiful. Long ago in the kingdom of Magadha, there was a queen named Khema, who was considered the most beautiful woman in the kingdom. This was not a minor detail in her life. It was the central fact around which everything else was organized. She had been beautiful since childhood, and beauty in her world, as in most worlds, was a form of power. It opened doors, secured alliances, determined her position in every room she entered. She had learned early and thoroughly that her beauty was her most valuable asset, and she had arranged her life accordingly. She was also the chief queen of King Bimbisara, the same Bimbisara who had sat on a hillside with a young ascetic and asked him what he was looking for. Bimbisara had, over the years, become a devoted follower of the Buddha. He attended teachings regularly. He spoke about the Dhamma at home. He encouraged his household to come and hear the Buddha teach. Khema did not go. She had heard that the Buddha taught about impermanence, about the fading of all things, including beauty. She was not interested in hearing this. She was, in fact, specifically and deliberately, not interested in hearing this. She knew, in the way that intelligent people know things they have decided not to examine too closely, that the teaching would be directed at exactly the things she most valued about herself. And she had no intention of sitting in front of the teacher and having that thing dismantled. She avoided the Vuvana for years. Bimbisara, who understood his queen well enough to know that direct encouragement would not work, tried a different approach. He had court poets compose songs about the beauty of the Vuvana, the bamboo grove, the ponds, the gardens, the quality of light through the canopy in the early morning. The songs described it as the most beautiful place in the kingdom. Khema heard the songs. She was, despite herself, curious. She loved beautiful things. This was not a flaw. It was simply who she was. And the descriptions were genuinely appealing. Eventually, her curiosity about the grove overcame her wariness about the teacher who lived in it. She went to the Vuvana. She told herself she was going to see the gardens. The Buddha saw her coming. He understood, with the particular clarity that the texts attribute to him, exactly what Khema valued and exactly what she was afraid of, and he did not begin with a teaching about impermanence. Instead, he created, through means the texts describe as a display of psychic power, though the psychological truth of it is more interesting than the supernatural framing. The vision of an extraordinarily beautiful young woman standing near him, fanning him. The woman was more beautiful than Khema, radiant, young, perfect in every detail that Khema's world valued. Khema looked at her, and then, as Khema watched, the woman aged. Not slowly, not gently, but visibly, progressively, the way time moves when you are watching it instead of living inside it. The radiant young woman became middle-aged, then old, then ancient, then... The texts are not delicate about this. A corpse. The same face, the same person, the full arc, compressed into a single vision. Khema watched all of it. What happened in Khema in that moment is not recorded in words. The texts simply say that she understood that the vision accomplished what years of avoiding the teaching had prevented. Not by arguing with her attachment to beauty, not by telling her that beauty was wrong or shallow or unworthy, but by showing her in a single image the complete truth of what beauty is. It is real. It is also temporary. Both things are true simultaneously, and the suffering comes not from the beauty, but from the refusal to hold both truths at once. Khema had been holding only one. She had been living as though the beauty were permanent, organizing her life around its maintenance and display, deriving her sense of self from it, avoiding any teaching that might disturb the arrangement. The vision did not take the beauty away. It simply showed her the whole picture. And in seeing the whole picture, she was free. She asked to ordain as a nun that same day. Bimbisara gave his consent. The texts record this without drama, as though a king releasing his chief queen to become a wandering nun were an ordinary thing, which perhaps in that household it was. Khema became a nun. She practiced with the same intensity she had previously brought to the cultivation of her appearance. The same attention, the same discipline, redirected entirely. She progressed quickly. She became one of the most accomplished practitioners in the entire community. The Buddha eventually named her one of his 2 chief female disciples, the foremost in wisdom. The woman who had spent years avoiding a teaching about impermanence became, in the end, one of the clearest teachers of it. There is a text, the Khema Sutta, in which a king named Pasenadi asks her a series of profound philosophical questions about the nature of the self and what happens after death. Her answers are precise, uncompromising, and completely without the need to perform certainty or humility. She simply knows what she knows and says it plainly. The king, after the conversation, goes to the Buddha and reports what she said. The Buddha confirms, she said exactly what I would have said. The lesson Khema's story is about the particular kind of avoidance that intelligent people practice, the avoidance of the thing they already know, on some level, to be true. She was not avoiding the teaching because she was ignorant of it. She was avoiding it because she understood it well enough to know what it would cost her. The teaching about impermanence was not abstract for Khema. It was personal. It was aimed directly at the thing she had built her life around. The thing that had given her power and position and a sense of who she was in the world. Most of us are avoiding something in this way, not out of stupidity, out of intelligence. We understand enough to know that if we really looked at the thing, if we really let the teaching land, something would have to change. And change is expensive. Change means giving up the story we have been telling about ourselves and finding out what is underneath it. Khema gave up a great deal. She gave up the position of chief queen, the beauty that had defined her, the life that had been organized around both. What she found underneath was something that did not depend on any of it. The vision she saw was not cruel. It was complete. It showed her the whole truth of the thing she loved. Not to take it away, but to free her from the need to protect it. We are all, in some way, avoiding the Vivana. We all have a teaching we are not going to. A truth we are circling without entering. A song about a beautiful garden that we find appealing, but whose composer we are not quite ready to meet. Khema went, eventually. She told herself she was going to see the gardens. The gardens were real, and so was everything else she found there. You have been sitting with these stories for a long time now, and I want to thank you for that. It takes courage to stay with grief instead of running from it. It takes a kind of quiet bravery to sit in the dark and listen when everything in you might be wanting to look away. These 10 stories are not a cure for what you are carrying. They were never meant to be. Grief does not have a cure. It has a path, and the path is not around the pain, but through it, slowly, with as much honesty and as much gentleness as you can manage on any given day. The Buddha did not tell the mother who had lost her children to stop weeping. He did not tell the king that a wise man would not grieve. He did not tell the woman who had given everything to tell her that her tears were a failure of practice. He sat with them, he stayed, he looked at their pain directly and did not look away. That is what these stories are asking you to do for yourself tonight. To stay with what you are feeling, to look at it directly, to trust that you are strong enough to feel it without being destroyed by it. Because you are. You would not be here if you were not. The people you have lost are with you, not in the way they were before. Nothing will make them be here in the way they were before. But in the way that love works when it has nowhere left to go except inward, except deeper, except into the very foundation of who you are. They are in the way you love. They are in the things you cannot stop caring about. They are in the particular way you understand what matters and what does not. They are at your roots. And you are still growing, slowly, imperfectly in the mud. But growing, tarry them with you. Keep going, and know that somewhere in the long, unbroken line of every human being who has ever loved and lost, you are not walking alone.